Hey everyone, this is a section from Hal Draper's Karl Marx's Theory of Revolution, Volume 1, State and Bureaucracy. The chapter that I'm reading is titled The Bonaparte Model. And the reason I'm doing this is because I want to kind of get a feel for how Marx understood Bonapartism, because it's one of the ways that the Soviet Union was characterized by Trotsky. So here we are. All right, let's go. The tendency of the bourgeois state under pressure to revert back to more authoritarian and despotic forms of government does not arise only from a working class threat from below. Another factor imparting the same tendency is one of the characteristics making for the political inaptitude of the capitalist class, as summarized in the preceding chapter, namely, the, quote, exuberance of internal hostilities, end quote. The fact that, quote, no other ruling class is so profusely crisscrossed internally with competing and conflicting interest groups, the dog-eat-dog pattern, end quote. Marx. It may be helpful to think of these two factors as being respectively the vertical and horizontal components of social struggle in the system, without necessarily equating them in importance. The horizontal struggle takes place among sectors of the ruling classes themselves, not only between different blocks of the bourgeoisie, but also pitting landowning interests, however bourgeoisified, against various bourgeois interests. In practice, to be sure, such horizontal social structures can rarely take place without involving the vertical class struggle of the exploited class against the tops. Conflicts with the ruling circles tend to stimulate or unleash intervention from below, and conversely, the threat of subversion from below may divide the tops either on how to deal with the problem or in terms of whose interests are mainly endangered. In practice, therefore, these components of the historical social struggle tend to interpenetrate, with the driving force coming from below, vertically, But whatever their source, if the internal conflicts become so unmanageable as to threaten the stability of the system, the resolution of the conflict by authoritarian means becomes the lesser evil for every stratum that shares in the benefactions of the status quo. Footnote. For a broader view of this historical pattern, this proposition should be linked with the explanation in Chapter 11, Section 7 of the three subsidiary tasks of the state. The third of these subsidiary tasks is precisely the resolution of internecine disputes that might otherwise disrupt the social fabric. This suggests that the other two subsidiary tasks may also play a role in the tendency of the state toward autonomization, and authoritarianism, and I believe they do, though to a lesser extent. From a basic standpoint, then, the present discussion could be derived directly from the statement about the tasks of the state. End footnote. If the bourgeoisie can no longer control the social jolts and tremors within the framework of democratic forms, its own preservation demands that, as a class, it yield up direct political power to other and firmer hands, the better to safeguard its socio-economic rule. For Marx, the classic case that acted out this proposition was the situation in France leading from the February Revolution of 1848 to the military dictatorship established by Louis Napoleon Bonaparte in the coup d'etat on the 2nd of December 1851. The analysis of this original, quote, Bonapartism was the subject of his work written directly after the events, the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, which is perhaps his most brilliant historical study. Footnote. This was obviously Engels' opinion, judging by his many recommendations to students of Marxism. The present chapter will be devoted mainly to this work. It is the source of all quotations not otherwise ascribed. The title refers to the analogous coup d'etat of November 9th, 1799, parenthesis, the 18th Brumaire in the calendar of the French Revolution, end parenthesis, by which the first Napoleon established his military dictatorship. The analogy with the 18th Brumaire, and even the content of Marx's first paragraph, were given in Engels' letter to Marx the day after the coup. End footnote. Its pervasive theme is the relation between the state power and the various social groups thereof, and an outstanding characteristic is its painstaking dissection of the complexity of the historical situation, to which we will not be able to do justice here. Section 1. The problem posed. Today's reader has to recapture the contemporary historical background of the 18th Brumaire, for it is not an abstract treatise but an analysis of the news of the day as it happened. In July 1830, the Restoration monarchy had been brought down by a timid bourgeois Republican effort at revolution, which succeeded only in replacing the Bourbons with a constitutional monarchy headed by Louis Philippe, a bourgeoisified royalty. Never a very strong regime, the July monarchy of Louis Philippe hit the rocks with the Industrial Depression of 1847. The following year saw the outbreak of the first Europe-wide revolutionary upsurge. In France, the Second Republic was proclaimed in February. Louis Philippe's bourgeois monarchy, in which, quote, a limited section of the bourgeoisie ruled in the name of the king, end quote, was now replaced by a bourgeois republic in which, quote, the whole of the bourgeoisie will now rule, end quote, or so they thought. The Constituent Assembly, which was elected with the help of peasant and clerical support, was thoroughly bourgeois and set out to settle accounts with the main class danger from below, the Paris proletariat. The liberal Tocqueville reported, quote, I saw society split in two, those who possessed nothing united in a common greed, bracket, sick, and bracket, those who possessed something in a common fear. No bonds, no sympathies existed between these two great classes. Everywhere was the idea of an inevitable and approaching struggle, end quote. In the face of mass starvation among the workers, the bourgeois Republicans provocatively cut down on the welfare program. The workers' response was the, quote, June insurrection, the most colossal event in history of European civil wars, end quote, up to then. Quote, the bourgeois republic triumphed. On its side stood the aristocracy of finance, the industrial bourgeoisie, the middle class, the petty bourgeoisie, the petty bourgeois, the army, the lumpen proletariat, organized as the mobile guard, the intellectual lights, the clergy, and the rural population. On the side of the Paris proletariat stood none but itself. More than 3,000 insurgents were butchered after the victory, and 15,000 were transported without trial. With this defeat, the proletariat passes into the background of the revolutionary stage, end quote. At this point, all the social strata and their political representatives were united against the vanguard proletariat of Paris. The savage, parenthesis, because terror-stricken, end parenthesis, slaughter of the rebel movement eliminated the threat of proletarian revolution for more than 2 decades. But, as Marx stressed, the threat still remained in the background. The foreground of the picture is going to concern the tug-of-war among the various strata of, quote, those who possess something, end quote, the property-owning classes and their hangers-on. The problem which the 18th Brumaire addressed mainly was not the role of the state with respect to the proletariat, a role which had been amply demonstrated by the June days. Quote, it had revealed that here, bourgeois republic signifies the unlimited despotism of one class over other classes, end quote. Parenthesis, this class despotism is what Marx elsewhere called the, quote, class dictatorship, end quote, of the bourgeoisie. And there's a chart here that says from February to the coup d'etat. To aid the reader in following Marx's analysis of events in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, here is a chronological table of the main developments that took place between the February Revolution and Bonaparte's coup d'etat. In this work, Marx divides the story into 3 main periods or phases as follows. 1. The, quote, February period, headed by a provisional government. 2. The, quote, Republic of the Constitution of the Republic, end quote, headed by the Constituent National Assembly. And 3. The, quote, period of the Constitutional Republic, end quote, headed by the Legislative National Assembly and brought to an end by coup d'etat. And here's the chart. It says, first period, 1848, February 22nd, Uprising in Paris. February 24th, Louis-Philippe abdicates, Second Republic proclaimed. April 23rd, elections to the Constituent National Assembly, victory of bourgeois Republicans. May 4th, Constituent Assembly meets. Second period. May 15th, the workers' demonstration invades Assembly, proclaims a revolutionary government. Blanqui, Barbès, others are arrested. June 23rd to 26th, the June Uprising, workers' rebellion in Paris suppressed by terror and Cavaignac dictatorship. November 4th, new constitution completed. December 10th, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte elected president of Republic. December 20th, President Bonaparte installed, forms cabinet. 1849. January 29th, Constituent Assembly votes its own dissolution under pressure of troops in Paris. April, French begin attack on the Roman Republic. May 28th, Legislative Assembly meets. Third period. July 13th, the suppression of demonstration, abortive revolt, by Ledru Rollin's radicals. October 31st, President Bonaparte installs a cabinet of his own men, de Hautpoul cabinet, 1850, March 10th, Assembly by elections swing to left. 1851, July 15th, Assembly rejects constitutional revision permitting second term for President Bonaparte. December 2nd, coup d'etat, Bonaparte seizes power with help of army. Aftermath. December 21st, plebiscite held by Bonaparte to sanction coup. 1852, November 2nd, Empire, quote, Second Empire, end quote, proclaimed with Bonaparte as Napoleon III. Okay, so back to the text, back to the main body of text. The problem which Marx set himself to unravel was, rather, the subsequent role of the state with respect to the crisscrossing conflicts among the property-owning classes themselves, which is united to crush the June Rising. The immediate subject is the role of the state with respect to the ruling classes themselves. After June, the wide united front of the righteous upholders of, quote, property, family, religion, order, end quote, was going to narrow down, as one slice of it after another was cut off from political rule, like the famous salami, end parenthesis. After the June scare, the simplest bourgeois reform demand was going to be stigmatized as a subversive, quote, attempt on society, end quote, and as, quote, socialism, end quote, until the very heroes of law and order who had suppressed the proletarian insurgents were themselves cast aside like squeezed lemons. Is this process which we are now going to follow for the light it casts on the phenomenon of state autonomization? New section, Section 2, Bankruptcy of Bourgeois Liberalism. The next months marked the political rule and then collapse of the, quote, pure bourgeois Republicans, one of whose leaders was General Cavaignac, the executioner of the June days. Quote, it was not a faction of the bourgeoisie held together by a great common interest and marked off by specific conditions of production. Footnote. Note that here, as elsewhere, Marx repudiates the latter-day pseudo-Marxist notion that every party necessarily represents a separate class or social group interest. This party reflected an ideological current within a class. Parenthesis, for the general issues, see the preceding chapter, page 332, end parenthesis. Back to the quote. It was a clique of Republican-minded bourgeois, writers, lawyers, officers, and officials that owed its influence to the personal antipathies of the country against Louis-Philippe, to memories of the old Republic, to the Republican faith of a number of enthusiasts, above all, however, to French nationalism, whose hatred of the Vienna treaties and of the alliance with England it stirred up perpetually. The industrial bourgeoisie was grateful to it for its slavish defense of the French protectionist system. The bourgeoisie as a whole for its vicious denunciation of communism and socialism. End quote. Marx. This bourgeois party came to power, quote, not through a liberal revolt of the bourgeoisie, but through a rising of the proletariat against capital, a rising laid low with grapeshot. End quote. Marx. The party's ascendancy did not come about through an ascending line of progressive struggle as it had once dreamed when it opposed the monarchy. Its accession to power was not a, quote, revolutionary event, end quote, but rather, quote, the most counter-revolutionary, end quote. Marx. It was this liberal bourgeois party which presided over the drafting of the Constitution for the new republic. On the one hand, it wanted to extend the vote to the mass of the bourgeoisie itself. On the other hand, it was afraid of universal suffrage, which went beyond bourgeois bounds. Still feeling the heat generated by the February Revolution, it had to twist and turn. Quote, the narrow electoral qualification of the July monarchy, bracket, of Louis Philippe, end bracket, which excluded even a large part of the bourgeoisie from political rule, was incompatible with the existence of the bourgeois republic. In lieu of this qualification, the February Revolution had at once proclaimed universal suffrage. The bourgeois republicans could not undo this event. They had to content themselves with adding the limiting proviso of a 6 months residence in the constituency. The old organization of the administration, of the municipal system, of the judicial system, of the army, etc., continued to exist inviolate, ... end quote, Marx. There were two consequences related to state forms. One, as Marx mentions later in the work, the old state apparatus was not smashed, it was merely taken over. And two, the democratic liberties apparently guaranteed in the Constitution were turned into frauds, and the executive power was separated from and counterposed to the legislative, representative, in the manner which we detailed in preceding chapters. Quote, such was the Constitution of 1848, end quote, Marx, which collapsed before Bonaparte at a mere touch, Marx concludes. While this constitution was being fabricated, the bourgeois Republican general Cavaignac was maintaining the, quote, state of siege, end quote, martial law, end in Paris. Quote, if the constitution is subsequently put out of existence by bayonets, it must not be forgotten that the constitution was likewise, quote, if the constitution is subsequently put out of existence by bayonets, it must not be forgotten that it was likewise by bayonets, and these turned against the people, that it had to be protected in its mother's womb, and by bayonets that it had to be brought into existence, end quote. Marx. Thus these, quote, respectable Republicans, end quote, Marx says bitterly, quote, produced, a splendid invention, periodically employed in every ensuing crisis, end quote, eagerly adopted by other continental powers, the, quote, state of siege, end quote, device to keep the masses under military control at critical points. But the military learned from this. If the armed forces of the state were, quote, periodically laid on French society's head to, render it quiet, end quote, Marx, if they were periodically allowed to act as judge, censor, and policeman, quote, as the highest wisdom of society and as its rector, end quote, then were not these same armed forces, quote, bound to hit upon the idea of rather saving society once and for all by proclaiming their own regime as the highest and freeing civil society completely from the trouble of governing itself, ... all the more as they might then also expect better cash payment for their higher services, ... end quote, Marx. Thus, by giving the armed forces their head to suppress the masses, quote, the pure Republicans, end quote, also prepared the ground for the coup d'etat of Bonaparte's Praetorians. Having exhausted its role, this liberal bourgeois party was given its quietus when Bonaparte got himself elected president in December 1848, the squeezed lemon syndrome. Marx here refers to the analysis of this period which he had made in his earlier class struggles in France. In sum, the liberals were defeated mainly by the massive peasant vote, but the result was also greeted by the army, which had garnered neither pay nor glory from the liberals in exchange for the dirty work it had done, by, quote, the big bourgeoisie which hailed Bonaparte as a bridge to monarchy, end quote, Marx, and also by the petty bourgeoisie and the proletariat, who saw in the vote a revenge on the hated party of Cavaignac for their own slaughter in June. This is the famous pattern of, quote, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, end quote, which has helped more than one despot to power, end parenthesis. New section, the pattern of permanent counter-revolution. Now to the fore came, quote, the mass of the bourgeoisie, end quote. Especially the big bourgeoisie, the main body of the property-owning classes, as distinct from the ideological current which had been represented by the bourgeois liberals. Quote, this bourgeois mass was, however, royalist. One section of this bourgeois mass, the large landowners, had ruled during the Bourbon and Restoration and was accordingly legitimist. The other, the aristocrats of finance and big industrialists, had ruled during the July monarchy of Louis Philippe and was consequently Orleanist. The high dignitaries of the army, the university, the church, the bar, the academy, and of the press were to be found on either side, though in various proportions. Here, in the bourgeois republic, which bore neither the name Bourbon nor the name Orleans, but the name Capital, they found the form of state in which they could rule conjointly. End quote. Marx. This united front of the two kinds of royalists was the party of order, that is, the flag wavers of the slogan of law and order, meaning systematic repression of even mild bourgeois democratic reformers. The liberal Republicans slunk out of effective existence, quote, just as cowardly, mealy-mouthed, broken-spirited, and incapable of fighting, end quote, as they had been brutal in shooting down workers they were through. The party of order had helped Bonaparte to hound them and their constituent assembly out of existence, thereby helping to make parliamentarism a hollow shell, a shell which Bonaparte could easily crack later when he in turn had to get rid of his allies. Footnote. 2 decades later, Marx made the point more broadly, quote, in their uninterrupted crusade against the producing masses, they, the bourgeois parliamentarians, were, however, bound not only to invest the executive with continually increased powers of repression, but at the same time to divest their own parliamentary stronghold, the National Assembly, one by one, all of its own means of defense against the executive. The executive, in the person of Louis Bonaparte, turned them out. The natural offspring of the party of order republic was the Second Empire, of Bonaparte, end quote, Marx. With this turn in the situation, Marx paused for an interim generalization. In the First French Revolution, the shift of political dominance from the Constitutionalists to the Girondins and then to the Jacobins followed a, quote, ascending line, end quote. That is, as each political tendency brought the revolution as far as itself could go, it was, quote, thrust aside by the bolder ally that stands behind it, end quote. Now we have the reverse process. We are watching a revolution as it follows a descending line. Quote, the Proletarian Party appears as an appendage of the petty bourgeois Democratic Party. The Proletarian Party is betrayed and dropped by the bourgeois Democratic Party on the April 16th, May 15th, and in the June days. The Democratic Party, in the Democratic Party's turn, leans on the shoulders of the bourgeois Republican Party. The bourgeois Republicans no sooner believe themselves well established than the bourgeois Republicans shake off the troublesome comrade and support themselves on the shoulders of the party of order. The party of order hunches the party of order's shoulders, lets the bourgeois Republicans tumble, and throws itself on the shoulders of armed force, ... Each party kicks back at the one behind, which presses upon it, and leans against the one in front, which pushes backwards, ... End quote. Marx. In this situation, Marx explains, the period, quote, comprises the most motley mixture of crying contradictions, end quote. Marx. Contradictions which Marx proceeds to list in a brilliant vein of black humor. Among these contradictions was one which also provides the key for the next period. We have already mentioned it. The fact that the united royalists of the party of order could remain united only on the terrain of the republic, which they both detested. For as soon as restoration of monarchy came on the agenda, they split on the royal house to be restored. Monarchism, which they shared, divided them. Republicanism, which they hated, united them. This split among the royalists reflected more than simply the opposition of Lily to tricolor. Quote, under the Bourbons, big landed property had governed, with big landed properties, priests and lackeys. Under the Orleans, high finance, large-scale industry, large-scale trade, that is, capital, with its retinue of lawyers, professors, and smooth-tongued orators. The Bourbon, legitimate monarchy was merely the political expression of the hereditary rule of the lords of the soil. As the Orleanist and July monarchy was only the political expression of the usurped rule of the bourgeois parvenus. What kept the two factions apart, therefore, was not any so-called principles, it was their material conditions of existence, two different kinds of property. It was the old contrast between town and country, the rivalry between capital and landed property." End quote. Marx adds an important note on the relationship between these two rival forms of property, which qualifies the rivalry. Quote, "Orleanists and Legitimists found themselves side by side in the Republic, with equal claims. If each side wished to effect the restoration of that side's own royal house against the other, that merely signified that each of the two great interests into which the bourgeoisie is split, landed property and capital, sought to restore its own supremacy and the subordination of the other. We speak of two interests of the bourgeoisie, for large landed property, despite its feudal coquetry and pride of race, has been rendered thoroughly bourgeois by the development of modern society. Thus the Tories of England long imagined that they were enthusiastic about monarchy, the church, and the beauties of the old English constitution, until the day of danger wrung from them the confession that they are enthusiastic only about ground rent. End quote. Marx, 18th Brumaire. Under the corporate business title of the Party of Order, this united front of royalists, quote, exercised more unrestricted and sterner domination, end quote, over the rest of society than had ever been possible for it under either the Bourbons or Louis Philippe. Only, quote, under the form of the parliamentary republic, end quote, could these two royalist divisions of the bourgeoisie pool their strength and thus establish, quote, the rule of their whole and class instead of the regime of a privileged faction of it, end quote. But it was not only royalist sentiment which made these, quote, Republicans, end quote, hate and fear the Republic. Quote, instinct taught them that the Republic, true enough, makes their political rule complete, but at the same time undermines its social foundation, since they must now confront the subjugated classes and contend against them without mediation, without the concealment afforded by the crown, ... It was a feeling of weakness that caused them to recoil from the pure conditions of their own class rule, and to yearn for the former, more incomplete, more undeveloped, and precisely on that account less dangerous forms of this rule, that is, monarchist forms, end quote. Marx. We pass over the section in which Marx summarizes how the Party of Order next proceeded to smash its remaining adversary in Parliament. The party to the left of it, previously called the Petty Bourgeois Democracy or Social Democracy, the pinkish reformers led by Ledru Rollin. Footnote. Besides this section in the 18th Brumaire, the same ground had been covered in even greater detail in the class struggles in France. This material will be important for another subject, the nature of social reformism. End footnote. Where the hell am I? Suffice to say that in this way the Party of Order also tore down the constitution and parliamentary prestige, facilitating Bonaparte's subsequent operation. With the reformist left put out of action, the Party of Order remained alone as the dominant force in Parliament, and thus isolated, confronted the executive power which was named Bonaparte. New section, State Gigantism versus Democracy. As an individual, Louis Bonaparte was a political adventurer. Louis Bonaparte was neither the first nor the last such type to make his adventure successful by gearing it to the historical need of the moment. Up to this point, the dominant politicians had tended to scorn Louis Bonaparte as a non-entity, as unnecessary, but these same politicians were now in the process of making themselves not only unnecessary but impossible. A vacuum was being created by their inability to rule, that is, by the inability of the bourgeoisie to rule as a class, which they reflected. The adventurer's game was to move into this vacuum, thereby making himself useful and finally necessary to a class which could not rule in any other form. There was no doubt that the two-headed bourgeoisie ruled the socio-economic domain, civil society, but it was paralyzed in the attempt to develop the state forms through which it could effectively wield the reins of power in the political domain. When civil society is paralyzed, there is only the state power power to take hold of things and keep them working. At the given moment, this meant Bonaparte. Bonaparte's next step was to detach the cabinet, (ministry) and itself, from parliamentary control and convert it, the cabinet, into an agency of the executive. The party of order lost every, quote, lever of executive power, end quote. Marx explains the significance of this step in a passage of great importance. Quote, "It is immediately obvious that in a country like France, where the executive power commands an army of officials numbering more than 500,000 individuals, and therefore constantly maintains an immense mass of interests and livelihoods in the most absolute dependence, ... end quote. Marx. We interrupt to note that while Marx wrote this passage in 1852, and of, quote, a country like France, end quote, the picture Marx painted is increasingly true of both the capitalist and, quote, communist, end quote, states in our own time. Hence this passage should be read with contemporary eyes. To continue, quote, ... where the state enmeshes, controls, regulates, superintends, and tutors civil society from its most comprehensive manifestations of life down to its most insignificant stirrings, from its most general modes of being to the private existence of individuals, where through the most extraordinary centralization this parasitic body acquires a ubiquity, an omniscience, a capacity for accelerated mobility and an elasticity which finds a counterpart only in the helpless dependence, in the loose shapelessness of the actual body politic. It is obvious that in such a country the National Assembly forfeits all real influence when the National Assembly loses command of the ministerial post. If it does not at the same time simplify the administration of the state, reduce the army of officials as far as possible, and, finally, let civil society and public opinion create organs of their own, independent of governmental power, end quote. Marx, 18th Brumaire. Marx's remedy for this gigantism of the state was going to be even more drastic later. The point now is Marx's diagnosis of the condition. The bourgeoisie, Marx goes on to explain, was incapable of opposing this development. Its contradiction was that it was simultaneously disarmed and defended by one and the same process, cured and castrated by the same operation. Quote, but it is precisely with the maintenance of that extensive state machine in its numerous ramifications that the material interests of the French bourgeoisie are interwoven in the closest fashion. Here it finds posts for its surplus population and makes up in the form of state salaries for what it cannot pocket in the form of profit, interest, rents, and honorariums. On the other hand, its political interest compelled it to increase daily the repressive measures and therefore the resources and the personnel of the state power, while at the same time it had to wage an uninterrupted war against public opinion and mistrustfully mutilate, cripple the independent organs of the social movement where it did not succeed in amputating them entirely. Thus the French bourgeoisie was compelled by its class position to annihilate, on the one hand, the vital conditions of all parliamentary power, and therefore likewise of its own, and to render irresistible, on the other hand, the executive power hostile to it. End quote. Marx, 18th Brumaire. The bourgeoisie suffered from another contradiction. It could hope to stand up politically to Bonaparte's state apparatus not just by mobilizing money bags, but by mobilizing the people behind it. Yet, quote, never did it display more ostentatiously the insignia of domination, end quote, in its capacity as an exploiting class. A symbol was its reestablishment of the wine tax, which hit the peasantry already burdened by low green prices. Out of social fear, the bourgeoisie leaned on the clergy for, quote, the superintendence of the French mind, end quote, on the gendarme for the superintendence of action, and on bureaucratic prefects and spies to forestall subversion. And the slightest reform was denounced as, quote, socialism, exclamation point, end quote. Parenthesis, this is 1850, not the 1950s, end parenthesis. Quote, even bourgeois liberalism is declared socialistic, ... end quote. There was class logic for this apparent silliness as usual. Quote, the bourgeoisie had a true insight into the fact that all the weapons which the bourgeoisie had forged against feudalism turned their points against the bourgeoisie's self, that all the means of education which it had produced rebelled against its own civilization, that all the gods which it had created had fallen away from it. It understood that all the so-called bourgeois liberties and organs of progress attacked and menaced the bourgeoisie's class rule, the bourgeoisie's class rule at its social foundation and its political summit simultaneously, and had therefore become, quote, socialistic, end quote. In this menace and this attack, it rightly discerned the secret of socialism, whose import and tendency it judges more correctly than so-called socialism knows how to judge itself, ... end quote. Marx, the 18th Brumaire. Along this road there followed, quote, the logical conclusion that its, bracket, the bourgeoisie's, and bracket, own parliamentary regime, that its political rule in general, end quote, must also be condemned as, quote, socialistic, end quote. For its political rule under democratic forms opened the door to the use of these same weapons against its social rule, against capitalism. The parliamentary regime created, quote, unrest, where the bourgeoisie needed tranquility, parenthesis, apathy, end parenthesis. Quote, the parliamentary regime lives by discussion. How shall it forbid discussion? Every interest, every social institution is here transformed into general ideas, debated as ideas. How shall any interest, any institution, sustain itself above thought and impose itself as an article of faith, ... The debating club in Parliament is necessarily supplemented by debating clubs in the salons and the pot houses, ... The parliamentary regime leaves everything to the decisions of majorities. How shall the great majorities outside Parliament not want to decide? How shall the great majorities outside Parliament not want to decide? When you play the fiddle at the top of the state, what else is to be expected but that those down below dance, end quote. Marx, 18th Brumaire. Here Marx is making his first detailed analysis of the basic incompatibility of capitalism with democracy. The analysis will be supplemented later when Marx works out the revolutionary alternative to parliamentarism. New section, section 5, the key to Bonapartism. Marx comes to the following conclusion, quote, thus, ... the bourgeoisie confesses that its own interests dictate that it should be delivered from the danger of its own rule, that in order to restore tranquility in the country, the bourgeois parliament must, first of all, be given its quietus, that in order to preserve its social power intact, the bourgeoisie's political power must be broken, ... end quote. Marx, 18th Brumaire. Here we come to the key to Bonapartism. In order to preserve the bourgeoisie's social power, its political power must be broken. In order to preserve the bourgeoisie's social power, its political power must be broken, ... Quote, ... that the individual bourgeois can continue to exploit the other classes and to enjoy undisturbed property, family, religion, and order only on condition that their class be condemned along with the other classes to like political nullity, that in order to save its purse, it must forfeit the crown, and the sword that is to safeguard it must at the same time be hung over its own head as a sword of Damocles. End quote. Marx, 18th Brumaire. One second. Trying to copy this here. Sorry about this. This is annoying. Oh, come on, you son of a gun. Ah, God, I know this is annoying. Sorry. Anyway, continuing on. So Bonaparte was able to get away with breaking the political rule of the bourgeoisie as a class, expressed through its parliamentary domination. He wooed the workers with demagogic if empty reform schemes, with the help of Saint-Simonian, quote, socialists, at the same time that he allied himself with high finance in the cabinet. He let the parliamentarians lull themselves with electoral, quote, victories, while he gathered the police powers into his own hands. When the bourgeois parliamentarians showed their hand by outlawing universal suffrage, he came out for suffrage, knowing that the levers to manipulate it were in his hands alone, and he organized his stormtroops, called the Society of December 10th, mainly out of the disintegrating, quote, scum of all classes, end quote, the lumpen proletariat. While he usurped the political power of the assembly, he shouted that, quote, France demands tranquility, end quote. The bourgeoisie did demand tranquility. The assembly was afraid to fight back, quote, by so doing, it would give the nation its marching orders, and it fears nothing more than that the nation should move, end quote. Marx. The danger of being defended from below is worse than that of being defeated from above. Such is the principle of the Kerenskys in every epoch. This socially determined cravenness of the bourgeoisie allowed Bonaparte to take over control of the army unchallenged, and thus, quote, the party of order declared that the bourgeoisie has forfeited its vocation to rule, end quote. Marx. The parliamentary majority opposed to Bonaparte fell apart as desertions from its camp multiplied, quote, out of sheer egoism, which makes the ordinary bourgeois always inclined to sacrifice the general interest of his class for this or that private motive, end quote. Marx. The assembly became a mere talking shop, but the deputies went through the motions of winning meaningless parliamentary victories. This is quote, that peculiar malady, parliamentary cretinism, end quote. Marx. That is, the illusion that activity in parliament has a meaning independent of the social struggle outside. Even now, with economic discontent growing among the lower classes, the party of order could have won back some mass support, thereby possibly throwing Bonaparte into its arms. But all Bonaparte's puppets had to do to stop this was, quote, to conjure up the red specter, end quote. Quote, instead of letting itself be intimidated by the executive power with the prospect of fresh disturbances, it ought rather to have allowed the class struggle a little elbow room, so as to keep the executive power dependent on itself. But it did not feel equal to the task of playing with fire, end quote. Marx. By a maneuver threatening revision of the Constitution, Bonaparte further set the two royalist factions of the party of order against each other. The split weakened both. Outside Parliament, the mass of the bourgeoisie now yearned only for, quote, a strong government, end quote, one which would ensure tranquil conditions for business and security against economic discontent. The leaders of high finance had gone over to Bonaparte even before this. The London Economist declared, quote, the president is the guardian of order and is now recognized as such on every stock exchange of Europe, end quote. The London Economist. Quote, by the aristocracy of finance must here be understood not merely the great loan promoters and speculators in public funds, in regard to whom it is immediately obvious that their interests coincide with the interests of state power. All modern finance, the whole of the banking business, is interwoven in the closest fashion with public credit. A part of their business capital is necessarily invested and put out at interest in quickly convertible public funds. Their deposits, the capital placed at their disposal and distributed by them among merchants and industrialists, are partly derived from the dividends of holders of government securities. If in every epoch the stability of the state power signified Moses and the prophets to the entire money market and to the priests of this money market, why not all the more so today, when every deluge threatens to sweep away the old states and the old states' debts with them, end quote. Marx. Thus the growing interpenetration of finance capital in the state power was a weapon in Bonaparte's hands. The industrial bourgeoisie also demanded tranquility and strong government, especially without the onset of business depression. Quote, it proved that the struggle to maintain its public interest, its own class interest, its political power, only troubled and upset it, as it was a disturbance of private business, end quote. Marx. Above all, the bourgeoisie demanded stability and turned against its own parliamentary mouthpieces and ideologists, whose very squirmings were now upsetting to the status quo. by such servility to Bonaparte, quote, it declared unequivocally that it longed to get rid of its own political rule in order to get rid of the troubles and dangers of ruling, end quote. Marx. At the same time, quote, this bourgeoisie which every moment sacrificed its general class interest, that is, its political interest, to the narrowest and most sordid private interest, end quote, had the gall to denounce, quote, the stupidity of the masses, the vile multitude, end quote, for the state of affairs. The same masses it helped shoot down every time they raised their head. Quote, now picture to yourself the French bourgeois, how in the throes of this business panic his trade-crazy brain is tortured, set in a whirl and stunned by rumors of coup d'etat and the restoration of universal suffrage, end quote, until he, quote, madly snorts at his parliamentary republic, quote, rather an end with terror than terror without end, end quote, end quote. Marx. Under all these conditions, Bonaparte would finally pull off his coup d'etat of December 2nd, 1851, without successful opposition. Second. New section, section 6. The autonomized state and the classes. Now the executive power had smashed the legislative power. Now it seemed that, quote, all classes equally impotent and equally mute fell on their knees before the rifle butt, end quote. In this way the executive power was reduced to, quote, its purest expression, end quote. It was set up, quote, as the sole target, end quote, against which the subsequent forces of revolution would concentrate. Quote, this executive power with its enormous bureaucratic and military organization, this appalling parasitic body, end quote, summarized Marx, had been created by the absolute monarchy and then proliferated into, quote, a state authority whose work is divided and centralized as in a factory, end quote. It had been strengthened as a centralized repressive power by the parliamentary republic and struggle against revolution. Quote, all revolutions perfected this machine instead of smashing it, end quote, notes Marx, in an early reference to the revolutionary task of dismantling the old state machine. Footnote, 4 years after Marx, Tocqueville noted the same pattern with approbation. Quote, since 89, the administrative system has always stood firm amid the debacle of political systems. For though in each successive revolution the administration was, so to speak, decapitated, its body survived intact and active, the same duties were performed by the same civil servants. End quote. End footnote. Quote, the parasites that contended in turn for domination regarded the possession of this huge state edifice as the principal spoils of the victor. End quote. Marx, 18th Brumaire. Under the previous French regime, the state bureaucracy, quote, however much it strove for power of its own, end quote, had been only the means through which the bourgeoisie prepared or carried out its class rule. Quote, only under the second Bonaparte does the state seem to have made itself completely independent, end quote. And this apparent independence of the state was conditional, quote, and yet the state power is not suspended in mid-air. Bonaparte represents a class, and the most numerous class of French society at that, the small-holding peasants, end quote. Marx. Represents here, the word represents here meant that Bonaparte presented himself as the defender of the peasantry and thus based Bonaparte's power on them, a class, quote, incapable of enforcing their class interest in their own name, end quote. Footnote, looking back in 1871, Marx put it this way, quote, the peasants were the passive economical basis of the Second Empire, end quote. Or again, the Second Empire was, quote, supported by the passive adherence of the peasantry, end quote. Marx. See Chapter 20, page 499 and 501 for additional comment on the phrase, quote, the state power is not suspended in midair, end quote, end parenthesis, end footnote. This, qualified Marx, was true only of the conservative bulk of the peasantry, not of its radicalized elements who were able to look beyond their small land parcels. But it was the conservative bulk of the peasantry that provided both the votes and the armed forces for the establishment of the military dictatorship. As Engels later summarized it, quote, Louis Napoleon founded the empire, ... on the votes of the peasants and on the bayonets of their sons, the soldiers of the army, end quote. Engels. Resting on this backward mass, the executive power manipulated a simulacrum of universal suffrage as a plebiscitary device. Using the state power, Bonaparte nourished, quote, an enormous bureaucracy, well-gallooned and well-fed, ... an artificial caste, for which the maintenance of this regime becomes a bread-and-butter question, end quote. But while the broad butt of this autonomized state rested on the peasant mass as its support, Bonaparte knew well where economic power lay, quote, as the executive authority, which has made itself an independent power, Bonaparte feels it to be his mission to safeguard, quote, bourgeois order, end quote. But the strength of this bourgeois order lies in the middle class. Bonaparte looks on himself, therefore, as the representative of the middle class and issues decrees in this sense, end quote. Marx. But there was a permanent contradiction in Bonapartism, quote, nevertheless, he, Bonaparte, is somebody solely due to the fact that he has broken the political power of the middle class and daily breaks it anew. Consequently, Bonaparte looks on himself as the adversary of the political and literary power of the middle class. But by protecting the middle class's material power, Bonaparte generates its political power anew, end quote. And in fact, as we know, the political power of the bourgeoisie was going to regenerate itself eventually under the protection which Bonapartism gave to its socioeconomic power. Quote, industry and trade, hence the business affairs of the middle class, are to prosper in hothouse fashion under the strong government, end quote. At this point, it was Marx's prediction. When Engels looked back after 4 decades, it was possible merely to report, quote, Louis Bonaparte took the political power from the capitalists under the pretext of protecting the capitalists, the bourgeois, from the workers, and on the other hand, the workers from the bourgeois. But in return, Bonaparte's rule encouraged speculation and industrial activity, in a word, the upsurgence and enrichment of the whole bourgeoisie to an extent hitherto unknown, end quote. Engels. New section, Bonapartism, the class equilibrium. On the 2nd of December 1851, when the adventurer Bonaparte established his dictatorship over France, no political observer or thinker understood that something new and different of world historic importance had just occurred in the modern world, whatever analogues exist in the past. That applied to Marx and Engels like everyone else for at least 1 week. Engels' next day letter to Marx was punctuated by words like comedy, farce, silly, infantile, stupid, and never left this superficial level. There was no hint of an insight into what had taken place. As we have mentioned, this common contemporary reaction left its mark in the first sentence of Marx's great essay, a sentence which is as undeservedly famous as it is shallow, leaving aside Hegel's inflated generalization that, quote, all, end quote, great historical events occur twice, quote, the first time is tragedy, the second is farce, end quote, and granting the comedic elements in Bonaparte's rise to power, as in Hitler's, it was a concession to the short-sighted punditry of the time to view the advent of Bonapartism as a farce. This initial reaction was refuted by the rest of the work. Footnote. It appears that Marx wrote Chapter 1 in about 3 weeks after the coup d'etat and sent it off for publication. Chapter 2 seems to have been written in January, Chapters 3 to 5 in February. The whole was not finished until March. It is not until Chapters 3 to 4 that Marx's essential theory of Bonapartism is set down. End footnote. Marx's first letter to Engels about the event avows frankly that he is, quote, quite bewildered, end quote, he is, quote, quite bewildered by these tragicomic events in Paris, end quote. Marx ventures the suggestion that, quote, at any rate, it seems to me that the situation has been improved rather than deteriorated by the coup d'etat. It is easier to cope with Bonaparte than would have been possible with the National Assembly and its generals, and the dictatorship of the National Assembly was standing at the gate, end quote. Marx. At this point, a week after the coup, the letter underlines how much Marx had to learn very fast about the nature of the state and revolution as illuminated by the phenomenon of Bonapartism. What did Marx learn? Let us sum up the French experience on how the state machine achieved a formal autonomy from political control by the bourgeoisie or any other class of society, while the bourgeoisie surrendered all forms and channels of the bourgeoisie's political rule in exchange for the preservation of the bourgeoisie's socioeconomic dominance. 1. The state moves towards autonomization insofar as an unresolved class struggle balances the power of contending classes against each other. 1. The state moves towards autonomization insofar as an unresolved class struggle balances the power of contending classes against each other. The, quote, secret of Bonaparte's victory, wrote Marx in 1858, lay, quote, in the mutual prostration of the antagonist parties, end quote, with the help of the onset of a period of prosperity following his coup. Quote, it was the total apathy, the politically used up blasé state of mind of these classes, bracket, the middle classes, end bracket, which allowed Louis Napoleon to establish his power, end quote, wrote Engels the same year. The precondition was mutual exhaustion of the contending classes in a struggle without issue. The state's power balancing act could be effective because it could demagogically appeal to each class against the other in a situation that offered no good alternative to demagogy. Bonaparte, wrote Marx in 1856, quote, made his coup d'etat on two diametrically opposite pretenses. On the one hand, proclaiming it was his mission to save the bourgeoisie and, quote, material order, end quote, from the red anarchy to be let loose in May 1852, bracket, when elections were due, end bracket, and on the other hand, to save the working people from the middle-class despotism concentrated in the National Assembly, end quote. But the class resentments whipped up could not be fought out. Quote, as against both the workers and the capitalists, bracket, wrote Engels in a pamphlet closely checked by Marx, end bracket, Bonapartism distinguishes itself by preventing them Bonapartism distinguishes itself by preventing them from coming to blows. That is, it protects the bourgeoisie from forceful attacks by the workers, promotes a little peaceful skirmishing between the two classes, and, for the rest, deprives both of them of any trace of political power. No right to organize, no right to assemble, no freedom of the press, universal suffrage under such bureaucratic pressure that opposition votes are almost impossible, a police economy which was unheard of up to now even in police-ridden France. Moreover, a section of the bourgeoisie as well as of the workers is directly bought. The former through a colossal credit swindle, whereby the money of the small capitalists is lured into the pockets of the big capitalists, the latter through colossal state works, which alongside the natural independent proletariat concentrate an artificial pro-empire proletariat dependent on the government in the big cities. Finally, national pride is flattered by apparently heroic wars, bracket, this regime, end bracket, exists only to keep the workers under a tight rein with respect to the bourgeoisie, end quote, Engels. In an article written about the same time that Marx was finishing the 18th Brumaire, Engels explained for Chartist readers the, quote, real causes why the French proletarians remained comparatively inactive in December last, end quote. That is, in face of Bonaparte's coup. First of all, he explains that, quote, whatever Louis Napoleon took from other classes, Louis Napoleon took it not from the working classes, end quote, but from the middle classes, quote. Not that Louis Napoleon would not, quite as gladly, have robbed the working classes of anything that might appear desirable to Louis Napoleon, but it is a fact that in December last, bracket 1851, end bracket, the French working classes could not be robbed of anything because everything worth taking had already been taken from them during the 3 years and a half of middle-class parliamentary government that had followed the great defeats of June 1848, Thus the working class had, at the moment of the late coup d'etat, very little, if anything, to lose in the chapter of political privileges. But, on the other hand, the middle and capitalist class were at the time in possession of political omnipotence, And for them it was indeed a hard case to be robbed of all this, and to be reduced at once to the state of political nullity to which they themselves have reduced the working people, The struggle then on the 2nd of December lay principally between the middle classes and Louis Napoleon, the representative of the army, end quote. Engels. But while the workers could hardly be moved to shed their blood in order to fight the enemy of their enemy, that did not mean they had no interest in the outcome, even if they had no, quote, direct political privilege, end quote, to lose. What they had to lose were opportunities to struggle for power. Quote, thus, they could not let the occasion pass without showing the two opposing forces that there was a third power in the field, which, if momentarily removed from the theater of official and parliamentary contentions, was yet ever ready to step in as soon as the scene was changed to its own sphere of action, to the street, end quote. The workers' problem was this: if they rose against Bonaparte, wouldn't they simply be helping to restore the rule of the bourgeois class enemy which had slaughtered their militants? Quote, and if they at once declared a revolutionary government, would they not, as was actually the case in the provinces, frighten the middle class so much as to drive them to a union with Louis Napoleon and the army? End quote. Thus the working class was in no position to strike out for itself and declined to go into the streets on behalf of one or the other enemy. Under these conditions, the class struggle was not abolished but immobilized in equilibrium. Quote, the whole secret of Louis Napoleon's success is this, that by the tradition of his name, Louis Napoleon has been placed in a position to hold for a moment the balance of the contending classes of French society. The balance of the contending classes of French society. For it is a fact that under the cloak of the state of siege by military despotism, which now veils France, the struggle of the different classes of society is going on as fiercely as ever, end quote. Though not by forcible means at the moment. Engels emphasizes that Bonaparte's opportunity came only after all the social classes had demonstrated their incapacity to rule, and thus exhausted not only themselves but their credit. After the February Revolution had upset the power of the, quote, large bankers and stock jobbers, end quote, each class had a shot at power. First the workingmen, quote, during the days of the first revolutionary excitement, end quote. Then the Republican petty bourgeois under Le Rollin, then the bourgeois Republicans under Cavaignac, lastly the bourgeois royalists of the National Assembly majority, quote, none of these classes had been able to hold fast the power they for a moment possessed, ... end quote. The royalists, uniting the landed interest and the, quote, moneyed interest, end quote, feared lest power returned to the hands, quote, of the working class, who themselves might be expected to have become fitter to turn it to account, end quote. Making use of all these divisions, Bonaparte used the peasant vote, the lumpen demonstrators, and the army's force, quote, to step in and assume a more or less absolute sway over those classes, none of which, after a 4 years' bloody struggle, had proved strong enough to seize upon a lasting supremacy, end quote. Hence the success of the coup. Quote, thus the reign of Louis Napoleon is not superseding the class war. It merely suspends for a while the bloody outbreaks which mark from time to time the efforts of this or that class to gain or maintain political power. None of these classes were strong enough to venture at a new battle with any chance of success. The very division of classes is favored for the time being. Napoleon's projects, end quote. In resume, in the last section of the article, quote, we repeat, Louis Napoleon came to power because the open war carried on during the last 4 years between the different classes of French society have, sick, and worn them out, had shattered their respective fighting armies, and because under such circumstances, for a time at least, the struggle of these classes can only be carried on in a peaceful and legal way, ... Under these circumstances, a manner of speaking in the interest of all contending classes, that a so-called strong government should exist which might repress and keep down all those minor, local, and scattered outbreaks of open hostility, which, without leading to any result, trouble the development of the struggle in its new shape by retarding the recovery of strength for a new pitched battle. This circumstance may in some way explain to the undeniable general acquiescence of the French in the present government, end quote. The repeated emphasis on the stalemate of the contending classes may well recall the beginning of the Communist Manifesto, which stated the historical generalization that the class struggle has always, quote, ended either in a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large or in the common ruin of the contending classes, end quote. Neither of these denouements was yet the case, for the process had not ended. It was something in between, for the contending classes were not ruined by exhausted and deadlocked. The quote, recovery of strength for new pitched battle, end quote, was still ahead. New section 8, Bonapartism, Society in a Plaster Cast. 2. The state moves toward autonomization insofar as there is no other alternative to prevent society from shaking society's self apart in internecine conflict without issue. Two, the state moves toward autonomization insofar as there is no other alternative to prevent society from shaking itself apart in internecine conflicts without issue. This summarizes much that we have already seen in Marx's and Engels' discussions. In the 18th Brumaire and elsewhere, Marx stressed that the June defeat pushed the working class threat to the background, but that does not mean that it was pushed out of the picture. Behind the importance of the upper class, the impotence of the upper classes to resolve the issue of power, was their fear of moving in any direction that might open the way for a renewed proletarian assault. Quote, when the volcanic upheavings of 1848, wrote Marx and Engels, suddenly threw before the eyes of the astonished liberal middle classes of Europe the gigantic specter of an armed working class struggling for political and social emancipation, the middle classes, to whom the safe possession of their capital was of immensely higher importance than direct political power, sacrificed this power and all the liberties for which they had fought to secure the suppression of the proletarian revolution. The middle class declared itself politically a minor, unfit to manage the affairs of the nation, and acquiesced to military and bureaucratic despotism, end quote. Marx. In the following summary view that Marx included in his essay on the Paris Commune, we direct attention to the last sentences. Quote, the Bonapartist and empire, with the coup d'etat for its certificate of birth, universal suffrage for its sanction, and the sword of its scepter, professed to rest upon the peasantry, the large mass of producers not directly involved in the struggle of capital and labor. It professed to save the working class by breaking down parliamentarism, and with it the undisguised subserviency of the government to the propertied classes. It professed to save the propertied classes by upholding their economic supremacy over the working class. And finally, it professed to unite all classes by reviving for all the chimera of national glory. In reality, it was the only form of government possible at a time when the bourgeoisie had already lost and the working class had not yet acquired the faculty of ruling the nation. End quote. Marx. The autonomized state, then, steps into a vacuum created by the frustration of class power on all sides. 3. The autonomized state provides the condition for the necessary modernization of society when no extant class is capable of carrying out this imperative under its own political power. The autonomized state provides the conditions for the necessary modernization of society when no extant class is capable of carrying out this imperative under its own political power. In the present case, modernization meant industrialization above all, and industrialization meant bourgeoisification as long as the working class was still too immature to organize society under the working class's own aegis. The Bonapartist state had to adopt the bourgeoisie's economic aims and interests as the Bonapartist state's very own, not simply as a concession to a business partner, but in its own interest as well. It needed a modern industrial and economic development to pursue its own aggrandizement, too, in this era when imperial and military aspirations had become toothless without an economic capacity to give them bite. The propertied classes could well afford to be content with the, quote, strong government, which assured their interest along with its own, wrote Marx. Quote, when Louis Napoleon vaulted to a throne, vaulted to a throne, the sovereign princes and aristocracies of Europe, the great landowners, manufacturers, rentiers, and stock jobbers, almost to a man, exulted in his success as their own. Quote, the crimes of his, end quote, was their general chuckle. Quote, the crimes are his, end quote, was their general chuckle. Quote, but the fruits are ours. Louis Napoleon reigns in the Tuileries, while we reign even more securely and despotically on our own domains, in our factories, on the bourse, and in our counting houses. Down with all socialism, vive l'empereur, end quote. And next to the military, the fortunate usurper plied all his arts to attach the rich and powerful, the thrifty and speculating, to his standard, end quote. Marx. The Bonapartist state served the socioeconomic interests of the classes that owned the instruments of production, and these propertied classes, in turn, willingly plied their profit-taking under the political domination of the Bonapartist state, as long as it did not get in their way. In these terms, there was a special symbiosis between the socioeconomic ruling classes and the state they did not control directly. But this arrangement bore the seed of its own dissolution. Accelerated modernization meant, on the one hand, that a maturing bourgeoisie would begin to feel its oats, and on the other, that the Bonapartist state would begin to outlive the value of the services it rendered to the socio-economic order. In Chapter 18, we will return to the regime of Louis Bonaparte as it reaches the stage of dissolution, but first we must follow Marx and Engels as they broaden their historical conception of the nature of the Bonapartist state itself. That's the end of the chapter. Thanks for listening.